The truck was found when the water finally receded, but no one knows how long it had been down there. On a quiet Labor Day morning in 2025, a group of recreational divers near Lone Rock Beach, Utah, came across something buried halfway in the mud. It looked like just another piece of old industrial debris, but when rescue crews arrived and pulled it from the lake, everyone froze. It was a silver pickup truck, missing for nearly 2 years. Inside, they found something far more disturbing: human remains. His name was Dennis Keith Dillinger, 54 years old, last seen on December 1st, 2023, at a family dollar store in the small town of Kanab. He walked in, paid in cash, walked out, and then vanished. No calls, no strange activity. His phone, left behind. The truck, never found, until the water dropped just low enough for the truth to surface. Dennis Keith Dillinger wasn't the kind of name you'd see in the headlines. He wasn't an artist, a politician, or some internet personality. He was the kind of person most people might pass by without noticing, but if you ever spoke to him, you'd remember it. Dennis lived in Arizona, just a few hours' drive from Utah. He often visited Kanab, a small, quiet town most folks have never heard of, but one he seemed to love. These trips weren't for work. According to the few who knew him, they were just his way of clearing his head. Neighbors described him as polite, kept to himself, never loud, never caused trouble. He did everything on his own. No one really knew much about his personal life, except that he was single and often went off on weekend drives. A few acquaintances said he was private but not unfriendly, the kind of man who'd help you change a tire without asking a single question. At the local grocery store, folks remembered he always bought the same thing, one specific brand of coffee and a single can of food. Always paid in cash. Never said more than a sentence or two. But when he went missing, there was one thing that stuck in everyone's mind. Dennis wasn't the kind of man who lost track of things. He had a routine, a system, a way of life. And the strange thing was, he disappeared without a trace. No warning, no message. Just a silence too quiet to ignore. People who'd spoken to him before said Dennis wasn't the type to just take off to clear his mind. If something was bothering him, he'd go for a walk, not drive hundreds of miles and vanish. But the strangest part? No one really knew where he went, what he was doing, or what was on his mind in those final days before he disappeared. And by the time the community realized how little they truly knew about him, it was already too late. There was something even his closest relatives didn't know about Dennis. At one point, he had stopped talking to his family for nearly a year. It wasn't because of a fight. It wasn't resentment. He just slowly withdrew. Calls got shorter. Visits stopped happening. And eventually, he became the kind of person you say you'll call back later, but never quite do. One of his cousins recalled that just a few months before he went missing, Dennis finally replied to a message after 6 months of silence. Just one short line: "Everything's fine. Don't worry." It was enough to put people at ease, but also enough to make them stop asking questions. No one really knew what Dennis had been through in his past. There were whispers about something, a tragedy in the family, maybe a betrayal or a sudden death, but nothing was ever confirmed. Dennis didn't talk about it. He wasn't that kind of man. Even his closest neighbors said he always kept a distance. Polite, yes. Kind, absolutely. But private, to the very core. And for people like that, disappearing quietly is all too easy. In fact, it took nearly a week after he went missing for anyone to file a police report. No one thought anything was off, because Dennis often took long solo drives and came back just as quietly as he left. But this time, he didn't come back. And that isolation, what most thought was just a personal choice, became the reason no one noticed he was gone. Sometimes silence isn't peace. It's a cry for help that no one hears. On December 1st, 2023, surveillance cameras at a family dollar store in Kanab captured the last confirmed sighting of Dennis Keith Dillinger. He wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap, walking into the store at 10:12 a.m. He moved slowly between the aisles, like he was carefully choosing what to buy, or maybe just taking his time. No one seemed to notice him. Nothing about his behavior stood out. He paid in cash, didn't say a word more than necessary. The camera showed him pushing the door open and walking toward the parking lot. And that was the last time anyone ever saw him. No cameras caught the truck pulling away. No one could recall which direction he drove off. And there were no phone signals, not after that moment. The strange part, his phone was later found inside the house. Not in the truck, not dropped at the store, but neatly placed on a wooden shelf near the front door, still plugged in, untouched. It was his cousin who first realized something was wrong. 4 days later, when she couldn't reach him, and he didn't return home like usual, she came by to check. Everything inside was tidy, the door was locked, no signs of a break-in, but the truck was gone, and there was no note. A missing persons report was filed with the Kanab Police Department that very day, but the case was never treated as urgent. A single adult man, living alone, known to take long drives. It didn't raise red flags. Police assumed he had simply taken off for a break. Maybe he just didn't want to be found. But for the people who knew Dennis, something felt off. The same day Dennis was reported missing was the same day police quietly closed the file, just hours after opening it. According to the report, there were no signs of foul play, no footage of an abduction, no distress messages, and most critically, no one officially pushed for a full-scale search. No search teams were sent, no divers, no GPS tracking, because Dennis didn't own a smartphone. They just logged the report and waited. The family, despite not being in frequent contact, began reaching out. But when they asked police about traffic cameras or checking his bank records, the answer was the same. Unless there's evidence he's in danger, we can't go any further. In some unspoken way, Dennis's disappearance was treated like a choice, not an emergency. A few neighbors put up flyers around Page and Kanab. A handful of posts appeared on Facebook, but the story never caught traction. No local reporters, no public outcry. No one really treated it like something urgent. And all the while, one question kept hanging in the air, quiet, unanswered. If Dennis drove off that morning, why was his phone sitting neatly at home? No one thought he simply forgot it. Dennis was meticulous. Everywhere he went, he carried his backup charger, his coat, and his phone. Not to make calls, but to listen to the radio while driving. The phone sat exactly as if it had never been taken at all, and that changed everything. It raised the possibility that Dennis never came back home after that morning, or worse, that someone else came back without him. But there were no cameras on the street, no witnesses, no sign of forced entry, just a phone and a house that said nothing. So now the question is, if Dennis never came home that morning, who brought the phone back? Dennis's disappearance had almost faded from memory until 6 months later when an anonymous call came into the Kanab Police Department. A middle-aged man with a calm Western accent said just one thing: "I don't think he drove off on his own." When asked to elaborate, the caller hung up. No name, no follow-up. But that single sentence was enough to spark a whole new wave of questions. Dennis's family, who had quietly begun to accept that he was gone, pushed to reopen the case. They demanded a fresh investigation, to pull security footage near the store, check call records, trace the vehicle through registration logs, anything that might still be left. But it had been too long. Traffic camera footage had already been overwritten. The family dollar only kept security recordings for 90 days. What remained was human memory, and memory, as time passes, is unreliable. Even the statements from store employees didn't match. One said Dennis seemed in a hurry. Another remembered him standing by the candy aisle for a long time, like he was waiting for someone. But no one saw him with another person. No one was recorded at that time. A regular customer claimed to have seen a similar pickup truck turn down a dirt road near Lake Powell shortly after Dennis left the store. But it was a common model. No way to confirm if it was his. Then came a new detail. His bank account showed a large cash withdrawal just a week before he disappeared. But no one knew why. He didn't owe money. He hadn't made any big purchases. No flights, no hotel bookings. Stories began to contradict each other. Details no longer lined up with who Dennis was. Someone said, Dennis would never leave his phone behind. Another recalled, actually, he once forgot his phone for a whole week. No one could say for sure anymore. And that was the danger. When memory gives way to assumption, an assumption starts to rewrite the truth. Just as every lead seemed to go cold, a new voice emerged. This time, from someone no one had thought to ask, the neighbor across the street from Dennis. Her name was Marcia. She'd lived there nearly 20 years, kept to herself, rarely spoke, but always watched. She wasn't close to Dennis, but she was the last person to see his truck leave the garage. And what she remembered would change everything. I remember that morning clearly. I was out watering the plants. I saw the truck pull out. But Dennis wasn't driving. Marcia was certain. The person behind the wheel was a younger man, buzz cut, wearing a gray hoodie, and looked nothing like Dennis. She didn't call the police at the time. She assumed it was a friend or relative. Later, detectives followed up and took an official statement, but too much time had passed. No photos, no license plate, no way to verify. Her account became just a loose thread in the story. At the same time, from another corner of town, a gas station attendant, 3 miles from the Family Dollar, remembered something else. A man had come in that same day, asking for directions to the highway. He seemed lost, like he wasn't from around here, out of place. There were no cameras at the station, no name. Just one odd coincidence. He was wearing a gray hoodie. Once again, the picture grew more tangled, not clearer. Did Dennis loan his truck to someone? Did anyone know the code to his house? Or had someone been quietly watching his routine all along? No one had answers. But one thing was now certain. This story had to be told again, not through police reports, but through the eyes of the woman who saw it unfold. Marcia saw the truck leave, but if that wasn't Dennis, then where was he? When police began reviewing the list of people Dennis had interacted with in the months before he disappeared, one name came up more often than expected: Eli Matthews. Eli was a man in his 30s who had briefly rented a room near Dennis's neighborhood. According to the landlord, Eli and Dennis had greeted each other a few times. Not close, but not strangers either. But what made Eli stand out wasn't the relationship. It was a coincidence that was hard to ignore. Just 1 week before Dennis went missing, police had encountered Eli parked near the edge of Lake Powell, late at night. When questioned, he told officers he was just out for a walk to clear his head. Nothing seemed suspicious at the time. They let him go. Now, with Dennis's truck found not far from that exact area, Eli's name resurfaced, this time under a different light. When brought in for questioning, Eli denied any connection to Dennis. He claimed they'd never had a real conversation and that he hadn't even heard Dennis was missing until recently. But when investigators combed through old traffic cam footage from a rest stop near the lake, one blurry frame showed a man in a gray hoodie, matching the description from neighbor Marcia, entering a convenience store at 10:41 a.m. on the day Dennis vanished. No one could say for sure it was Eli, but the build, haircut, posture looked a lot like him. Police had no evidence to hold him, but questions started to build. Why was Eli near the lake, at that time? Why didn't he mention it during previous questioning? And why did everything he said sound plausible, but couldn't be proven? When news of the blurry footage leaked, suspicions grew fast. Eli, quiet with an unclear background, suddenly became the focus of online speculation. But the law doesn't work on rumors. No evidence, no charges, no arrest. Just a shadowy figure on a grainy screen, and a long list of questions with no answers. As the case was reopened and Eli faced more scrutiny, what angered Dennis's family and much of the community wasn't just what Eli might have done. It was how easily he'd slipped through the cracks. In the original report, Eli's name barely appeared. Even though police had questioned him near Lake Powell, the same week Dennis disappeared, there were no detailed notes, no photo, no license plate logged, just a single sentence. Nothing suspicious. And with that one line, Eli vanished from the radar for nearly 2 years. The question is, why? One retired investigator, who had worked the case early on, later admitted they didn't think it was anything serious. Dennis was an adult, lived alone, no history of threats. In other words, they didn't think a crime had occurred, so they never looked for a suspect. And in that lack of urgency, names like Eli drifted by, unnoticed. There were even rumors that Eli had connections to law enforcement in another state, and that a prior record may have been accidentally deleted. But no one could confirm that either. The real issue was this: if Marcia hadn't spoken up, if the anonymous caller hadn't said anything, Eli might never have been mentioned at all. A man, possibly a witness, possibly something more, passed through the entire system untouched. And now the community began asking tough questions. Who else was overlooked? How many people were dismissed as not suspicious? And if Dennis had been someone else, someone younger, more well-known, not living alone, Would any of this have played out differently? No one knows if Eli had anything to do with Dennis's disappearance, but everyone knows this. He's the only person who kept showing up around Lake Powell at just the right times and still walks free. Eli denies everything, but the lake has receded, and the past, no matter how long it's been buried, is beginning to surface. Just as the community had begun to turn its full attention toward Eli Matthews, a new piece of information surfaced, and it didn't come from the police. A true crime blogger who specializes in missing persons cases uncovered drone footage recorded by a tourist group on December 2nd, 2023, just one day after Dennis disappeared. The clip is less than 30 seconds long, but in it, a silver pickup truck can be seen parked near a patch of dirt by the edge of Lake Powell, in the exact spot where Dennis's vehicle was eventually found. But something about it doesn't add up. No one is inside, no one is nearby, and the tire marks show one thing clearly. The truck drove in, but never drove back out. If the vehicle had been there since December 2nd, it means it wasn't pushed into the lake later. It had been there from the start, which raises a new possibility. Did Dennis go to the lake alone? If true, it would shatter the entire theory built over the past 2 years. No suspect, no second driver, no foul play. Could this have been just an accident? But that idea opens a darker question, one no one wants to answer. If it was an accident, then why were there no skid marks? Why did the truck end up completely submerged? And no one heard a thing? And if Dennis really went alone, then how accurate was Marcia's statement? The police were finally forced to do what they had avoided for nearly 2 years. Reconstruct every moment of that day. They brought Marcia back in to confirm her memory of that morning. But this time, she hesitated. She wasn't sure about the time anymore. She wasn't certain the person driving wasn't Dennis. She wasn't even sure if she had seen it from her porch or through the curtains. In just minutes, the case's most critical witness began to unravel. And with that, every theory collapsed. No more reliable eyewitness. No more obvious suspect. No clear direction for the investigation. Only a lake and a truck that had sat at the bottom for almost 2 years. Just as public confidence began to crumble, a forgotten detail from the original case file unexpectedly came back to light. One of the forensic techs who had examined the pickup reported this. On the passenger side floor, there was a pair of shoes. Not Dennis's. They were plain sneakers. Smaller size. Silver gray. Caked in wet sand. No blood. No usable DNA. But clearly, they didn't match any shoes Dennis was known to wear. And what sent chills down investigators' spines was where the shoes were found, placed neatly, as if someone had taken them off before getting in. There was no logical explanation. If Dennis was alone, whose shoes were they? If someone else had been in the truck, why weren't there any other signs? DNA, footprints, personal belongings? And if this was a crime, why leave behind something so obvious? And most disturbing of all, why hadn't these shoes ever been mentioned? In any report for nearly 2 years, some believed it was an oversight by the initial forensics team. Others suspected the records had been altered, and a few feared something more unsettling, that someone had returned to the scene after the truck sank and intentionally left a trace behind. It sounds impossible, but in a case with no answers, every theory is just as terrifying as the next. And those shoes, small, weathered, silent, suddenly became the new center of attention. The silver gray shoes didn't belong to Dennis, so who put them there? And more importantly, why? At last, after 2 long years, the remains of Dennis Keith Dillinger were found. But strangely, no one felt any sense of closure. No suspect was arrested. No charges were filed. No final footage. No note. Nothing, except a truck buried deep beneath the lake, a body no longer whole, and a pair of shoes. No one could claim. Dennis's family held a quiet memorial. No press. No speeches. Just a few relatives and a handful of neighbors, people who once thought they knew him, but now realized they only knew the shadow he left behind. One cousin, through tears, said he was always there, in a way no one noticed. And then he disappeared, just the same. The case was officially reclassified as a cold case. No leads, no clear suspect, no resolution. But no one in the community truly believed it was just an accident. There were too many mismatched pieces, too many unanswered questions. And something about the way Dennis lived and vanished made it all feel swallowed by silence. People began to ask, did the system fail him because he wasn't rich or famous or loud enough to be noticed? Did someone know something and simply choose to stay quiet? And above all, the most painful question of all, did Dennis really leave alone, or did someone else decide his fate for him? Those questions have no answers, but they haven't gone away. They remain, alongside the quiet shadow of a man who once existed, as if never fully seen.